So, tell me, when was the first time you heard Lenny's music? And
Early,
what effect did it have on you?
early 70s, I think about 1973, maybe 1974, at a time when I was just starting to get serious about playing the guitar. I was starting to listen to instrumental guitars of various genres, and a friend of mine gave me a copy of Lenny Breau's second album that she had found in the basement of a house that she was living in a pile of trash down there. And at that point, I was not into jazz and knew nothing about jazz guitar. And I was grabbed by it. I mean, I was instantly interested in it, and then very quickly it grew on me and just opened up a whole other way of seeing music over time.
Okay, Mike, we're gonna, that chair, if you look, you see it's in the corner?
This black chair?
Yeah, the black chair. That's good.
Okay.
And Mike, go ahead and lean forward. I'll tell you when way too much.
Okay.
Right
Okay.
there, right there. No further than there.
Okay, I'll stay on the side. Thank you, Joe.
All right, we're still recording.
What made you decide to write the book on Lenny?
Well, it's interesting because there are a lot of guitarists that I really like, and a lot of guitarists that have affected me. But there was something about Lenny's story that went beyond that. I thought that there were a lot of, within Lenny's story, that there were a lot of really interesting narratives. His background, his dedication to the guitar, the way he learned. And I was always intrigued by it. And I would run across little bits and pieces of information about him, but I could never get the whole story. So I was always curious. And then when I began writing professionally, which was in the later 90s, I just decided right off the bat that I would start this larger project. And just got the research underway and went for it.
So, if you could, I'm going to have you walk me through his timeline.
Mm-hmm.
We'll start at the beginning. Tell me a little bit about Lenny's childhood.
Well, Lenny was born into a very musical family. His mother and father at the time were pretty much the most esteemed musical couple certainly in Maine, and I would say in New England. They were playing country music, and that had just hit that region in popularity a few years before. So Lenny was born right into that. And from the time he was a toddler, he was showing a lot of natural ability for music. The family moved up to the Maritimes in eastern Canada when Lenny was about 7 or 8, and Lenny started playing guitar, mainly little fiddle tunes that he learned from the son of the people that he was staying with. And he learned extraordinarily fast, even at that point. Around the time he was 12, he became interested in Chet Atkins, also just jumped into that style, and by the time he was 14 or 15, he had pretty much mastered it, and it was a difficult style to master. Around 14 or 15, he began working as a studio musician in a small studio in Maine. And then his parents got a job working for CKY Radio in Winnipeg, moved up there. Lenny was playing country music. He was playing in his parents' band, but he was really interested in jazz. He met some folks in Winnipeg who opened that world up to him. Lenny was always very lucky in that way, that the teacher was always available to him. Whatever he wanted to learn, he would either search out that person or the person would become available to him. He became very popular in his hometown. He was a very busy studio musician and really received a lot of acclaim. He was not particularly happy with that world because he was a very creative player. He recorded a couple of albums for RCA in the late 60s, sponsored more or less by Chet Atkins, who was his great mentor and hero, I would say.
I'm going to back you up a little bit
Sure.
before I get too far ahead.
Mm-hmm.
Give me a little bit more detail about how the Boy Wonder sessions came about, if you could.
Okay. Lenny's father, Hal Lone Pine, had done some recording for RCA when he and Betty Cody were working out of West Virginia. And when he came back to the Maine area, he wanted to have some albums made for him that he could sell at the gigs that he did. And so just connected with Al Hawks, who was running Event Studios down in Westport. And Lenny just kind of came along for the ride, basically, and was working in his father's band. And Al Hawks was just knocked out by Lenny's ability. His ability to fit in, not only his solo ability, which was really incredible by that point, but his ability to fit in with whatever was taking place in the studio. And so he used them on lots of sessions, including straight ahead, late 50s rock and roll sessions. You know, he could really do it all, and certainly country sessions. But he was also noodling a lot in the studios. He loved to go down there and just listen to Al Hawks's enormous record collection. He was always absorbing music from whatever source he could, and he would play Al Hawks's little Gibson 00. And Al Hawks just happened to catch him doing it. He also worked with a fellow named Sleepy Willis, who was a very good guitarist. And they did some duos. He played with some bands. And Al Hawks was just canny enough to record this. It wasn't commercially released at the time, but he took really good care of the masters, and it was a real treasure for us.
Just describe his style of playing during that period.
Well, the style... Lenny had pretty much absorbed everything that he could from Chet Atkins, who was, you know, he's thought of as a country player, but he's a remarkably versatile player, and he, in fact, played on many of early rock and roll sides with Elvis and so on. And Lenny had absorbed all of that, pretty much. So he was playing the Chet Atkins style on the solo thing, Chet Atkins and Merle Travis. On some of the things they did with Sleepy Willis, there's definitely a little bit of a jazz influence. I would say he's not improvising the way he would a few years later, but he's phrasing in the way that a jazz guitarist would, and I think that he may have picked up some of that from Sleepy Willis, who was very influenced by Jimmy Bryant, who was a jazz country player. And they did some pop tunes together and some straight-ahead jazz tunes. They did a sort of gypsy jazz tune as well. I mean, they were just experimenting and having a really good time. But the essence of Lenny's style at the time was definitely the Chet Atkins style. And even when he was playing on rock and roll records, he was using that style.
So, when he gets to Canada, he's playing with his folks. And there's an incident that happens between he and his dad. Apparently there was a little falling out between he and his dad. Can you tell me a little bit about that story?
Well, by then Lenny had begun to, he was heavily into jazz at that point. And he was bored playing in his dad's band. So to liven things up a little bit, he would throw in these jazz riffs into country tunes. And he was warned not to by his father, and apparently at some gig somewhere in the prairies one night, he took a bebop chorus on some country tune, and backstage his father slapped him. Yeah.
And so that was that the end of their professional relationship?
No, it wasn't exactly the end of the professional relationship, and the thing is that one incident, it wasn't a discrete incident. I mean, there had been a lot of tension between them, and some of it was personal tension, had nothing to do with music. Lenny's parents were starting to split up, and Lenny was upset about that. And I think made it clear to his father that he was. And to that point, Lenny had always been a very obedient, unquestioning kid. And I think his father didn't like having his authority challenged in any way, whether it was musical or personal. And I think that had some bearing on it. It continued on for a little while, but it was actually Hal broke up the band for other reasons that are not quite clear. Probably at that point, his music was not doing really well. That music was on its way out. and rock and roll was taking over. Lenny was no longer interested in playing that kind of music, and I think it was just various circumstances that brought about the end of that band.
Tilt down a little bit, Jim.
Yep.
A little bit more. Good. So tell me when he began playing with Reg Kellen and Bob Erlinson. Actually, can you step back? When did his jazz playing begin to evolve? Because he starts out as a pretty straightforward country guy with a little bit with interest in jazz playing,
Mm-hmm.
but he goes from Boy Wonder sessions to doing the first Hallmark sessions. Complete leap.
Yeah.
Do you have any sort of understanding of how that came about, and what was the bridge that suddenly had this huge flowering of creativity? Because I mean, the first time I heard the Hallmark sessions, I'm like, holy shit, this guy's like Eddie Van Halen from 1960.
Mm-hmm.
And listening to the Boy Wonder sessions, which was just a few years earlier, straight country, completely different styles. It sounds like two different people.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's interesting because a lot could be said about the connection between jazz and country music. And Lenny was always aware of jazz. I mean, he had been listening to Django Reinhardt since before he played guitar. Country guitarists were very much into that. It was really, I mean, they may not have been playing it, but they were listening to it. A guitarist is a guitarist, whatever genre they're playing in, and they listen to everything, So Lenny was exposed to that early on, and he was, even when he was in Wheeling and he was 12 years old, he was listening to Stuff Smith, who was the great jazz violinist. So he was always listening to that. And you can hear it in the Boy Wonder sessions a little bit, that he wants to play it, he's edging towards it, he's throwing in these blues riffs. But in order to play jazz well at the level that he wanted, in order to play bebop, you really have to understand some basic precepts of music. And you can't totally rely on your ear. And Lenny had an incredible ear, but your ear is not necessarily going to tell you how many scales are available to play over a certain altered chord. And that's the kind of thing that Lenny wanted to know. He was a melodic improviser. He was playing. When he joined the Union in Winnipeg, and he got sent out to play with little pickup bands. And most of the guys playing in these bands were older men and were jazz musicians. And Lenny was faking it. He was playing by ear. He was playing little melodic riffs and just doing his best to keep up with them, but in a very classy, tasteful way. One of these musicians, Bob Erlinson, who was a very, very experienced jazz musician and a brilliant musician in his own right, connected with Lenny and saw Lenny's potential. And he and Lenny became very, very tight. And Bob just showed him everything. And Lenny, it seemed like there wasn't really almost a learning process. Bob would tell him something, and Lenny could do it almost immediately. And he was also listening to guitarists like Tal Farlow, Barney Kessel, and was picking up those riffs. Because he'd learned to play by ear, he had an extraordinary ear. And he just worked at it all the time, very, very hard. So, in any, there's no simple way to explain how he could have made that extraordinary leap. But those are some of the things that were going on, and you just have to chalk up a lot of it to really remarkable talent and to an incredible work ethic.